The carriage wheels stopped grinding against gravel, and silence fell over the Hale estate like a held breath. Baron Edmund Hale stood at the top of the stone steps, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had turned white. He watched the black carriage door open, and he already knew that whatever happened in the next hour would decide the fate of his entire family. A tall man stepped down from the carriage. He wore a long gray coat lined with dark fur, and his boots struck the ground with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and searching, as though he were measuring everything around him and finding most of it wanting. This was Lord Alden Voss, one of the richest men in the region, and a man whose name alone made lesser nobles nervous. Edmund walked down to meet him, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Behind him, the great house loomed with its cracked windows and patched roof, a building that had once been grand but now wore its decline openly, like a wound that refused to heal. "Lord Voss," Edmund said, bowing low, "you honor us with your visit." Alden did not return the bow. He simply looked past Edmund toward the house, his gaze cold and assessing. "I received your letters, Baron Hale, all 12 of them. I confess I ignored the first 10. Edmund's smile faltered, but he pushed forward anyway. "Then you understand my situation." "I understand that you owe more money than this house is worth," Alden said flatly. "I understand that your creditors have already begun circling like vultures, and that within a season, this estate and everything on it will belong to men who care nothing for your family's name." The words landed like a blow, but Edmund did not flinch outwardly. He had grown used to hearing the truth spoken without kindness. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Then you also understand why I wrote to you," Edmund said quietly. "You are a man of great wealth, and I am told you are searching for a wife. I have 3 daughters. Any one of them would make a fine match for a man of your standing." For the first time, something flickered across Alden's face, though Edmund could not name what it was. Perhaps amusement, perhaps something older and sadder. "A fine match," Alden repeated as though tasting the words. "Tell me, Baron, do you love your daughters?" The question caught Edmund off guard. "Of course I do." "Then how easily you offer them up, like goods on a merchant's table." Alden's voice was not angry, only tired, as though he had seen this exact scene played out many times before in many different houses, with many different fathers and many different daughters. "Do not misunderstand me. I am not here to judge you. I have simply learned, over many years, that desperation makes strange bargains seem reasonable. I am prepared to make you one such bargain." Edmund's heart beat faster. "Name it." "I will pay every debt you owe, every last coin to every last creditor cleared within the month. In exchange, I will marry one of your daughters." Alden paused, letting the offer settle in the cold morning air. "I do not care which one. I am not a young man chasing romance, Baron Hale. I am an old man who wishes for quiet companionship in the years I have left. Any daughter of reasonable temperament will do. Gather them, let me see them, and I will choose." For a moment, Edmund could not speak. Relief and shame warred inside him in equal measure. He had hoped for this outcome, had prayed for it through sleepless nights, and yet hearing it spoken aloud made him feel small, as though he had sold something that was never his to sell. "They are inside," Edmund said finally. "I will bring them to you." He turned and hurried up the steps, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and dread. Inside the house, the air was cooler, and the faint smell of dust and old wood clung to the halls. Edmund moved quickly toward the sitting room, where he knew his 2 eldest daughters would be waiting, as he had instructed them earlier that morning. Clara, the eldest, sat perfectly straight on the edge of a velvet chair, her hands folded in her lap, her hair arranged in careful curls that had taken her maid over an hour to complete. She looked up the moment her father entered, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Is he here, father?" she asked. "Is Lord Voss here?" "He is," Edmund said. "Come, both of you, he wishes to see you now." Miriam, the middle daughter, rose from the window seat where she had been watching the driveway for the past hour. She smoothed the front of her pale blue dress and glanced at her reflection in the small mirror by the door, adjusting a loose strand of hair before following her sister and father out of the room. Edmund led them through the house toward the front steps, his mind racing. He thought of Alira, his youngest daughter, and felt a small pang of guilt. He had not summoned her. She had left before dawn that morning, as she often did, to visit old Agnes Bell, a tenant on the estate who had been ill for weeks with a fever that refused to break. Alira had a gift for tending the sick, a gentleness that none of her sisters shared, and she rarely returned before midday. It did not matter, Edmund told himself. Clara and Miriam were both lovely, both accomplished, both capable of becoming a proper wife to a man like Lord Voss. There was no need to trouble Alira with this. She had never shown much interest in marriage or in noble suitors, preferring instead the company of the estate's tenants and the quiet work of caring for others. Better, Edmund thought, to let her remain undisturbed. When they reached the front steps, Alden was waiting exactly where Edmund had left him, his hands folded behind his back, his expression unreadable. Clara stepped forward first, offering a graceful curtsy, her smile polished and practiced. "Lord Voss," she said, "it is an honor to finally meet you. My father has spoken so highly of your accomplishments." Alden studied her for a long moment, saying nothing. Clara held her smile, though a faint tension crept into her shoulders under his silent scrutiny. Miriam stepped forward next, offering her own curtsy, softer and more hesitant than her sister's. "My lord," she murmured, keeping her eyes lowered in a show of modesty she had clearly rehearsed. Alden's gaze moved between the two sisters slowly, methodically, the way a merchant might examine two bolts of cloth before deciding which to purchase. There was no warmth in his expression, only careful calculation. Edmund watched anxiously, trying to read some sign of preference in the old lord's face, but Alden's expression remained a locked door. "You have raised them well, Baron," Alden said at last, though his tone carried no particular enthusiasm. "Both are graceful, both are, I assume, well versed in the management of a household." "They are," Edmund said quickly. "Clara has managed our accounts since her mother passed. Miriam is skilled in music and in correspondence." "Either would serve you well, my lord." Alden nodded slowly, but he did not smile, and he did not speak again for a long moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Clara's confident posture began to waver, though she fought to keep her expression pleasant. Miriam glanced sideways at her sister, then back at the ground, uncertain of what was expected of her. It was in that silence, that fragile, uncertain pause, that the sound of running footsteps broke through the morning air. All heads turned toward the path that led from the eastern fields, where a figure was hurrying toward the house, skirts gathered in one hand, hair loose and wind-blown, a basket swinging from her other arm. Alira had not known about the carriage in the drive until she was halfway across the field, and by then it was too late to slip in through the servants' entrance unnoticed. She had spent the early hours at Agnes Bell's cottage, helping to change the old woman's bedding and coaxing a bit of broth past her cracked lips, and she had lost all track of time. Her sleeves were still damp from the well water, and a strand of hair clung to her flushed cheek. She slowed as she reached the edge of the courtyard, suddenly aware of the small gathering before her, of her father's tense expression, of her sisters standing stiff and formal beside a stranger she did not recognize. Embarrassment flooded through her, and she considered, for one brief moment, turning and retreating the way she had come. But it was too late. The stranger had already seen her. Alden Voss went very still. He stared at Alira as though he had seen a ghost, his weathered face suddenly pale beneath its lines. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence in the courtyard grew heavy enough to feel. Edmund glanced nervously between his youngest daughter and the nobleman, unable to understand what had caused such a sudden, dramatic shift. Alira, feeling the weight of every eye upon her, straightened her spine and offered an awkward, hurried curtsy, her basket still clutched in one hand. "Forgive me," she said, breathless. "I did not know we had guests." Alden did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on her face, tracing her features with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable, as though he were searching for something he had lost long ago and never expected to find again. Who, Alden said slowly, his voice rough, is this? Edmund cleared his throat, caught entirely off guard. This is my youngest daughter, my lord, Elira. She was not meant to be part of this morning's introductions. I apologize for the interruption. She has been tending to a sick tenant and did not know of your arrival. Alden did not seem to hear the apology at all. He took a single step forward, his eyes never leaving Elira's face, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from the cold, calculating look he had worn moments before. Now there was something else there, something raw and unguarded, something that looked to Edmund's growing confusion almost like grief. I would like, Alden said quietly, for her to be included as well. Clara's polished smile cracked. Miriam's eyes widened in disbelief. And Elira, standing there with damp sleeves and a basket of herbs, felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she did not yet understand why. Elira did not understand what was happening. One moment she had been hurrying toward the house, hoping to slip inside before anyone noticed her disheveled appearance, and the next moment she was standing in the courtyard, the object of a stranger's unblinking stare, her father stammering apologies beside her. My lord, Edmund said again, his voice tight with confusion, surely you do not mean to include her. She is unprepared. She has not been groomed for this meeting as her sisters have. I do not care about grooming, Alden said, his eyes still fixed on Elira. I said any daughter would do, Baron Hale, and I meant it. That includes her. Clara's face had gone pale with anger, though she fought to keep her expression composed. Miriam looked between her younger sister and the nobleman with an expression of pure bewilderment, as though she could not understand what quality Elira possessed that she and Clara lacked. Elira herself felt heat rising in her cheeks, not from flattery but from mortification. She set her basket down slowly, buying herself a moment to gather her thoughts. My lord, she said carefully, I believe there has been some confusion. I was not told of your visit, and I certainly was not prepared to be considered for anything of this nature. That much is obvious, Alden said, and for the first time something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. But I did not ask to see a prepared young woman, Miss Hale. I asked to see your father's daughters. You are his daughter, are you not? I am, Elira admitted. But I have no wish to marry a stranger, my lord, however wealthy or well-intentioned he might be. I mean no disrespect. I simply believe such a decision deserves more than a single glance across a courtyard. Edmund's breath caught in his throat. He had never known Elira to speak so plainly to a nobleman, and he feared the consequences of her boldness. But to his surprise, Alden did not seem offended. If anything, his expression grew more thoughtful, more intent. You are right, Alden said slowly. It does deserve more than a glance. Forgive my abruptness. I did not mean to frighten you, Miss Hale. I was simply struck by something in your face, a resemblance to someone I once knew. The tension in the courtyard shifted slightly, curiosity replacing some of the earlier hostility. Clara's eyes narrowed, sensing an opportunity to steer the conversation back toward herself. Perhaps, my lord, you would prefer to continue our conversation from earlier, she said smoothly. I would be glad to show you the gardens my mother once tended. They are quite lovely this time of year. Alden barely glanced at her. In a moment, Miss Hale, he said, though his tone suggested he had already forgotten the offer. He turned back to Elira. Might I ask where you were this morning? Your father mentioned a sick tenant. Elira hesitated, unsure why a nobleman would care about such a mundane detail, but she answered honestly. Agnes Bell. She has lived on this land for over 30 years. She fell ill with a fever nearly 2 weeks ago, and there has been no one else to care for her properly. Her son works the fields from dawn until dusk and cannot always tend to her. And you go to her every day. When I am able, yes. Alden studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened. That is a kindness not many in your position would trouble themselves with, he said quietly. Most young women of noble birth would send a servant and consider their duty fulfilled. Agnes does not need a servant, Elira said simply. She needs someone who will sit with her and listen when she speaks of her husband, who passed years ago, and remind her that she is not forgotten by the world simply because she has grown old and poor. Servants are busy with other duties. I am not most mornings. Edmund watched this exchange with growing unease. He had expected Alden to be charmed by Clara's poise or Miriam's gentle modesty, not by Alira's blunt honesty about tending to a sick old woman in a cottage. And yet, Alden's attention had not wavered from his youngest daughter since the moment she had appeared, and Edmund could not decide whether this development filled him with relief or dread. "Baron Hale," Alden said, turning finally back to Edmund, "I would like to speak with your daughters individually, if you would permit it. Beginning, perhaps, with Alira, since she has already arrived, and there is no reason to make her wait further in her present state." Clara's composure cracked entirely at this. "My lord, surely propriety demands that the eldest be considered first." "Propriety," Alden said, with a faint, weary edge to his voice, "has rarely served me well, Miss Hale. I find I care little for its demands these days, but if it eases your concerns, I promise to speak with each of you in turn. I have not yet made any decision. I am merely gathering impressions." Edmund, sensing the fragile control he still held over the situation slipping further away with every passing moment, stepped forward and gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside, my lord, where you might be more comfortable. I will have tea brought to the drawing room." Alden nodded his agreement, and the small group made their way up the steps and into the house. Alira lingered at the back, still holding her basket, her mind spinning with confusion. She could not understand why a stranger's gaze had settled on her with such intensity, nor why he seemed to see something in her face that reminded him of someone else entirely. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Inside the drawing room, the faded elegance of better days was on full display. A large window let in soft morning light, illuminating the worn but once beautiful furniture, the tarnished silver candlesticks, the portraits of ancestors long since passed. Alden's eyes moved across the room slowly, taking in every detail, before finally settling once more on Alira, who had taken a seat near the window, still slightly out of breath from her earlier haste. Clara and Miriam sat stiffly on the settee across from him, exchanging glances that spoke of quiet, simmering frustration. Edmund hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether to remain or give the nobleman privacy, until Alden gestured for him to sit as well. "Tell me, Baron Hale," Alden said, once the tea had been poured and the servants had withdrawn, "how long has your family held this estate?" "Nearly 200 years, my lord," Edmund answered, grateful for a question that did not touch directly on the strange tension still hanging in the room. "My great-grandfather was granted the land after his service in the northern campaigns." "A proud history," Alden said, though his tone suggested his mind was elsewhere. His gaze drifted once more toward Alira, who sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, trying to appear composed despite the unease coiling in her stomach. "Miss Alira," Alden said suddenly, addressing her directly, "might I ask about your mother? Your father mentioned she has passed." The question caught Alira off guard, and a flicker of old grief crossed her face before she could mask it. "She died when I was young, my lord. I barely remember her." "And your father never remarried?" "He did not," Edmund answered on her behalf, his voice quieter than before. "I found I had little heart for it after losing her." Alden nodded slowly, his expression distant, as though he were turning over some private thought that had nothing to do with the conversation at hand. "Might I ask her name, your late wife's name?" Edmund frowned slightly at the unusual question but answered nonetheless. "Marguerite. Marguerite Hale, though her family name before our marriage was Wynne." Something shifted in Alden's face at the mention of that name, so subtle that only Alira, watching him closely now out of sheer curiosity, seemed to notice it at all. His jaw tightened, and his eyes, for the briefest moment, seemed to hold something like pain. "Wynne," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "A fine old name." "Did you know the family, my lord?" Edmund asked, curious now himself. "I knew of them," Alden said, recovering his composure quickly, though not quickly enough to erase the strange weight that had settled over the room. It was a long time ago. Forgive me, Baron. These old memories creep up unexpectedly sometimes when a man reaches my age. Clara, sensing the conversation drifting further from her, attempted once more to redirect it. My lord, I understand you keep a rather impressive library at your estate. I have always had a great fondness for reading. Perhaps you might tell me more about it. Alden turned toward her, his expression polite but distant, as though he were speaking to her from behind a great distance. Yes, Miss Hale, my library is quite extensive. I would be glad to discuss it with you another time. Another time. The words landed heavily, and Clara's polite smile thinned into something more brittle. Miriam shifted uncomfortably beside her sister, sensing the tide of the afternoon had already turned decisively away from either of them, though she could not fully understand why. Elira, meanwhile, sat quietly, turning over the strange exchange in her mind. There was something about the way Lord Voss had reacted to her mother's maiden name, something buried and painful that he had tried and failed to hide. She did not understand it, not yet, but she felt certain that his sudden interest in her had little to do with her face alone, and everything to do with some old story she had never been told. As the afternoon wore on and the tea grew cold in its cups, Alden rose at last, announcing that he would take his leave but would return within the week to continue their acquaintance. He bowed to Edmund, offered polite farewells to Clara and Miriam, and then, before departing, turned once more to Elira. Miss Hale, he said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that had not been present earlier in the day, I hope you will forgive an old man's strange behavior this morning. I did not mean to unsettle you. You did not offend me, my lord, Elira said carefully, only confused me. That is fair, Alden said, and for a moment something like sadness passed behind his eyes. I confess I owe you and perhaps your family an explanation, but it is not one I can give lightly nor quickly. When I return, I hope you will allow me the chance to speak with you properly. Not as a suitor inspecting a prospective bride, but simply as myself. Elira did not know how to respond to such a request, so she simply nodded, and watched as the old nobleman turned and walked back toward his waiting carriage, his steps slower now than they had been upon his arrival, as though the weight of old memories had settled heavily onto his shoulders. As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, Edmund turned to his daughters, his expression a mixture of relief and worry. Clara stormed from the room without a word, her anger barely contained. Miriam lingered, glancing at Elira with an expression that was not quite resentment, but not quite kindness either. Elira remained by the window, watching the carriage disappear beyond the trees, her mind still turning over the strange, unspoken sorrow she had glimpsed in Lord Voss's eyes when he had spoken her mother's family name. Whatever secret he carried, she realized, it was far older than this single morning, and far deeper than any simple matter of choosing a bride. She had no way of knowing yet just how deeply that secret was tied to her own life, or how much it would change everything she believed about her family's quiet, ordinary history. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the Hale estate the night Alden Voss's carriage disappeared down the drive, and Elira sat alone in her small room long after the household had gone quiet. She held a faded portrait in her hands, one of the few belongings that had survived from her mother's things, a small painted likeness of a young woman with soft brown eyes and a gentle, uncertain smile. Elira had looked at this portrait 100 times over the years, always with a quiet ache for a mother she barely remembered. Tonight, she looked at it differently, searching for some clue as to why a stranger's face had gone pale at the mention of the name Wynne. Downstairs, in the study that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, Edmund Hale sat across from his brother-in-law, Gareth, who had ridden over the moment word reached him of the nobleman's visit. Gareth was Marguerite's younger brother, one of the few remaining members of the Wynne family, and the only person still living who might know something of the past that Alden Voss seemed so reluctant to discuss. "You are certain he spoke her name?" Gareth asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "I am certain," Edmund said. The moment I said when, his entire manner changed. He grew quiet, almost sorrowful. I have never seen a man's face shift so quickly. Gareth was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in the hearth. "There was a story," he said finally, his voice low, "long before you married my sister. I was only a boy at the time, but I remember whispers among the older relatives, a story about our aunt, Eleanor Wynne." Edmund leaned forward. "Marguerite's aunt." "Yes, she died young, before I was even born, but the family rarely spoke of her, and when they did, it was always in hushed, careful tones, as though her memory were something fragile that might shatter if handled too roughly." Gareth rubbed his temples, trying to piece together fragments of memory long buried. "I recall my mother saying once that Eleanor had loved a man far above her station, a young nobleman whose family forbade the match. There was scandal and heartbreak, and in the end, Eleanor was sent away, married off quickly to another man to smother the rumors. She died not long after, of what my mother always described only as a broken heart, though I suspect there was more to it than that." Edmund's face had gone pale. "You believe Alden Voss was that young nobleman?" "I do not know," Gareth admitted. "But if he was, and if he has carried that grief for all these years, then it would explain why the sight of Elira, who I am told resembles our family's old portraits of Eleanor almost exactly, might have struck him so deeply." The two men sat in troubled silence, the fire popping softly in the hearth, each turning over the implications of what this meant for Elira, and for the fragile arrangement Edmund had so desperately sought only that morning. Meanwhile, in the room she shared no longer with any sister, having claimed the smaller chamber at the end of the hall as her own since childhood, Clara paced back and forth, her anger simmering beneath a carefully controlled exterior. She had spent weeks preparing for this match, learning everything she could about Lord Voss's preferences, his properties, his connections. She had imagined herself as his wife, mistress of a grand estate far finer than this crumbling manor, and she had no intention of allowing her younger sister, who had not even bothered to prepare for the meeting, to steal that future from her. She found Miriam in the hallway outside their father's study, clearly having overheard at least part of the conversation between their father and uncle through the door. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, pulling Miriam further down the hall out of earshot. "Some old family scandal, some dead aunt who looked like Elira. That is the only reason he is interested in her. It has nothing to do with her character or her charm. It is simply an old man chasing a ghost." "What does it matter why he is interested?" Miriam said quietly. "If the result is the same, he has already chosen to favor her over us." "He has not chosen anything yet," Clara snapped. "He said he would return. That means there is still time. We simply need to remind him of what a foolish match it would be, marrying a girl for her resemblance to a dead woman rather than for who she truly is." Miriam said nothing, though doubt flickered across her face. She had never enjoyed conflict, and the idea of scheming against her own sister sat uneasily with her, even as her own disappointment simmered beneath the surface. She had hoped, however faintly, that she might be the one chosen, freed from this decaying house and its endless debts. To see that hope slip away so suddenly, and to a sister who had not even wanted it, felt deeply unfair. The week that followed passed slowly for Elira, who continued her daily visits to Agnes Bell's cottage despite the strange cloud that now hung over her family's home. Agnes, propped up against her pillows, color slowly returning to her weathered cheeks, noticed the distraction in Elira's manner almost immediately. "You have something on your mind, child," Agnes said one afternoon, as Elira changed the dressing on a small wound on the old woman's arm. "You have barely spoken since you arrived." "It is nothing worth troubling you with," Elira said, though her hands paused briefly in their work. "Nonsense. An old woman with nothing but time on her hands needs a good story to pass the hours. Tell me." And so Elira told her, haltingly at first, then with growing openness, about the strange nobleman who had arrived unannounced, about his reaction to her mother's family name, about the tension now simmering between herself and her sisters. Agnes listened quietly, her sharp eyes never leaving Elira's face. Wynne, Agnes repeated thoughtfully when Alira had finished. I remember that name, though it has been many years since I last heard it spoken. Alira looked up sharply. You knew the family. I did not know them well, but I remember the stories, back when I was a young woman myself, working in the kitchens of a grand house not far from here. There was talk once of a young Wynne girl and a nobleman's son who fell in love against the wishes of both their families. It caused quite a scandal in its day, though such scandals fade quickly from memory once the people involved have passed. What happened to her? Alira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl, do you remember? Agnes's expression grew sad. She died young, if I recall correctly. Not long after being married off to another man entirely, someone chosen to end the scandal rather than to make her happy. It was a common enough story in those days, though no less tragic for its familiarity. Young love crushed beneath the weight of family pride and social standing. Alira sat back, her mind racing. If this was true, if the woman in that old story was somehow connected to her own family, and if Lord Voss had truly been the nobleman involved, then his sudden fascination with her began to make a terrible kind of sense. She was not being chosen for herself at all, but for her resemblance to a woman who had died long before she was even born. The thought left her feeling hollow and strangely angry, though she could not entirely say why. She had never wanted to be chosen as a bride in the first place, not for her father's debts, not for her sister's ambitions, and certainly not as a stand-in for someone else's lost love. When Alden Voss's carriage returned to the Hale estate exactly 1 week later, as he had promised, Alira was ready for him, though not in the way her father had hoped. She met him not in the formal drawing room, dressed in her finest gown as Clara had urged her to do, but in the garden behind the house, still wearing her simple day dress, her expression guarded and unwelcoming. Alden found her there among the overgrown rose bushes, and he stopped a respectful distance away, sensing immediately that her mood had shifted since their last meeting. Miss Hale, he said carefully, I hoped we might speak. I have heard a story, Alira said, without preamble, turning to face him directly. About a woman named Alina Wynne and a nobleman's son who loved her and lost her to family pride and cruelty. I believe you may know something of this story, my lord. Alden's face went very still, all pretense of polite formality draining away. For a long moment he said nothing at all, simply looking at her with an expression of such profound sorrow that Alira felt her anger falter slightly, despite herself. Yes, he said finally, his voice rough. I know that story very well, Miss Hale. I have carried it with me for over 30 years. Then it is true, Alira said. You were the nobleman. I was, Alden admitted. And Alina Wynne was the great love of my youth, taken from me not by death alone, but by my own family's pride, and by my own cowardice in failing to fight harder for her when it mattered most. The garden fell silent except for the distant sound of birdsong and the soft rustle of wind through the roses. Alira stood very still, absorbing the weight of his confession, feeling something inside her shift and rearrange itself, though she could not yet say into what shape. And now, she said slowly, you look at me and you see her. I did at first, Alden admitted. The resemblance struck me like a blow the moment you entered that courtyard. I will not pretend otherwise. But Miss Hale, I have had a week to sit with that first shock, and I have come to understand something important in that time. He took a step closer, his expression earnest. You are not Alina. You share her face, perhaps, and something of her spirit, from what little I have observed of your kindness toward the sick woman on your father's land. But you are your own person entirely, with your own thoughts, your own wishes, your own life ahead of you. I would be a fool and a cruelty to pursue you simply as a shadow of someone I lost long ago. Alira studied him carefully, searching his weathered face for any sign of deception, but found none. Then why have you returned, my lord, if not to claim me as some replacement for your lost love? Alden was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with obvious care. I returned because, despite the strangeness of how we met, I find myself genuinely curious about the woman you are, apart from any resemblance to my past. I returned because in one short morning, you showed more honesty and more genuine kindness than I have encountered in years among the polished, calculating nobility I usually keep company with. And I returned because, selfishly perhaps, I hoped you might allow me the chance to know you properly, without the shadow of a leaner standing between us, if you are willing to give me that chance. It was not the answer Alira had expected, and she found herself unable to summon the anger she had carried into the garden only moments before. In its place was something more complicated, something closer to cautious curiosity, tangled with lingering wariness. I do not know if I can give you that, she admitted honestly. Not yet. This is all still very strange to me, my lord. I understand, Alden said gently. I do not ask for an answer today. I ask only for the chance to earn your trust properly in whatever time you are willing to grant me. Nothing more. Alira considered him for a long moment, the autumn wind stirring the roses around them, carrying with it the faint scent of rain still clinging to the earlier storm. Finally, she gave a small, hesitant nod. Very well, she said. Time I can grant you, but nothing more than that, my lord, not yet. Alden's weathered face softened into something almost like relief, and for the first time since his arrival, Alira saw a glimpse of the man beneath the grief and the noble title. A man who had spent 30 years mourning, a love he had never fully let go of, now standing tentatively at the edge of something new, uncertain but hopeful, in a garden that had seen far too many years of silence. Neither of them yet knew how much more complicated the road ahead would become, nor how deeply the shadows of the past, and the jealousy simmering within Alira's own family, would soon threaten to unravel the fragile trust they had only just begun to build. The weeks that followed brought a strange new rhythm to the Hale estate. Lord Voss began visiting twice, sometimes 3 times a week, always in the late morning, always finding Alira in the garden or returning from her rounds among the tenants. Their conversations grew longer with each visit, moving slowly from careful, guarded exchanges into something closer to genuine ease. Alira found, much to her own surprise, that she looked forward to his arrivals, not out of duty or obligation, but out of curiosity about the man himself. Alden spoke to her of his estate, far to the north, of the orchards he had planted as a young man and watched grow over the decades, of the quiet library where he spent most of his solitary evenings. He spoke, too, though more rarely and with greater difficulty, of Elinor, of the young woman he had loved and lost, of the family pressures that had torn them apart before either had reached the age of 20. My father believed her family beneath ours, Alden explained one afternoon, as they walked slowly along the edge of the estate's overgrown orchard, autumn leaves crunching softly beneath their feet. It did not matter that Elinor was kind or clever, or that I loved her more than I have ever loved anything since. My father saw only her family's modest standing, and he forbade the match outright. And you did not fight him? Alira asked, though her tone held more curiosity than judgment. I tried, Alden said, his voice heavy with old regret. I was young and foolish, and I believed I could wear him down given enough time. I did not understand how quickly circumstances could be rearranged against my wishes. Within a single season, Elinor's family had arranged a hasty marriage for her to another man, one better suited to smoothing over the scandal our courtship had caused. By the time I understood the full weight of what was happening, it was already done. Did you never see her again? Once, Alden said quietly. Several years later at a distance across a crowded market square. She looked tired, older than her years, though she was still young in truth. Our eyes met for only a moment before her husband called her away. I never had the chance to speak with her again. She died the following winter of a fever that took many that year. I did not learn of her death until months afterward, when it was far too late to do anything but grieve alone. Alira listened in silence, feeling the weight of his old sorrow settle over her like the autumn chill in the air. She understood now, more fully than before, the depth of grief that had driven him to that first strange, desperate reaction upon seeing her face. It was not a small or foolish thing, she realized, to carry such loss for 30 years, to let it shape the whole of a man's later life into something quiet and guarded and alone. "I am sorry," she said finally, "for what you lost." "Thank you," Alden said, "though I did not tell you this story seeking your pity, Miss Hale. I told you because I wanted you to understand why I reacted as I did that first morning, and because I did not want any secrets standing between us, however small or old they might seem." Alira appreciated his honesty, though it did little to ease the deeper uncertainty still coiled within her. She had agreed to give him time, to allow him the chance to prove himself as something more than a grieving old man chasing the ghost of his youth. But she had not yet decided what she truly wanted from this strange, unexpected arrangement, nor whether she was capable of caring for a man so many years her senior, regardless of his kindness or his sorrow. Back at the house, tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface of daily life. Clara had grown colder toward her younger sister with each passing week, her polite conversation replaced by clipped, distant civility that fooled no one in the household. She spent long hours in her room, writing letters to distant relatives and family friends, seeking any information that might give her some advantage in reclaiming Lord Voss's attention. It was during one such letter-writing session that Clara received a reply that made her sit up sharply in her chair, her earlier frustration replaced by something colder and more calculating. The letter came from a distant cousin who had once served in the household of Alden Voss's late father, and it contained details of the old scandal that Clara had not previously known, details that painted the story in a far less flattering light than the one Alden himself had shared with Alira. According to the cousin's account, it was not solely Alden's father who had opposed the match with a leaner Wynne. Alden himself, according to whispered rumors from that household staff decades ago, had ultimately bowed to pressure with less resistance than he now claimed, choosing his family's approval and his inheritance over any true fight for the woman he professed to love. The letter suggested that his grief, however genuine it might now appear, was tangled with guilt over his own choices, not simply the cruelty of others. Clara read the letter twice, turning the information over in her mind, searching for the best way to use it to her advantage. She did not yet share it with anyone, not even Miriam, choosing instead to hold the knowledge close, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. That moment arrived sooner than she expected. Lord Voss had been invited to dine with the family that evening, a rare formal occasion that Edmund had arranged in hopes of smoothing over the growing tension within his household. Clara dressed with particular care that night, choosing a deep green gown that had once belonged to her mother, and arranged her hair in an elegant style she knew flattered her features. Dinner proceeded pleasantly enough at first, with polite conversation flowing between Edmund and Alden about matters of estate management and the coming harvest. Alira sat quietly near the end of the table, occasionally exchanging glances with Alden that carried a warmth neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. Miriam picked at her food, saying little, still uncertain of her place in the shifting dynamics of the household. It was over the second course that Clara chose to strike. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying a sweetness that did not entirely mask the sharp edge beneath it, "I confess I have heard an interesting story recently regarding your history with the Wynne family. I wonder if you might clarify a few details for us." Alden's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and his expression grew guarded. "What details would those be, Miss Hale?" "Only that I understand the end of your courtship with Alina Wynne was not quite as simple as pure family cruelty forcing apart two helpless lovers," Clara continued, her tone deceptively light. "I understand there was rather more compliance on your part than perhaps you have led certain members of this household to believe." The table fell silent. Edmund's face paled, his eyes darting nervously between his eldest daughter and their noble guest. Alira's stomach tightened with a mixture of confusion and dread, uncertain what Clara meant, but sensing immediately that her sister intended harm. Alden set down his fork slowly, his expression darkening. "I do not know where you heard such a story, Miss Hale, nor do I appreciate having my private history dissected at your dinner table without my consent." "I mean no offense, my lord," Clara said, though her satisfied expression suggested otherwise. "I simply believe that if my sister is to consider a future with you, she deserves the full truth of your past, not merely the version most flattering to your own conscience. Elira looked between her sister and Alden, her heart pounding. "Clara, what are you talking about?" Clara turned to her sister with an expression of exaggerated concern. "I have learned, dear sister, that Lord Voss's version of his old romance may not be entirely accurate. That while he claims his family alone forced the end of his courtship with a leaner Wynne, there are those who remember it differently, who recall a young man far more willing to abandon his love in favor of his inheritance than he now admits." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Alden's face had gone pale, his jaw tight with a mixture of old shame and present anger. Edmund attempted to intervene, urging his daughters toward calmer conversation, but the damage had already been done. Elira's eyes remained fixed on Alden, searching his face for some sign of denial, some reassurance that Clara's words held no truth. "Is this true?" Elira asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alden was silent for a long, agonizing moment before he finally spoke, his voice heavy with old regret. "There is truth in it," he admitted, "though not the whole truth, and certainly not the truth your sister intends for you to believe. I did not fight as hard as I could have in those early days. I was young and frightened of my father's anger, and yes, unwilling at first to risk the inheritance that would one day be mine. It took me longer than it should have to understand what truly mattered. By the time I found the courage to fight properly for Alina, it was already too late. That failure of courage is a shame I have carried every day since, far heavier than any grief over circumstances beyond my control." The honesty in his voice, raw and unguarded, seemed to steady something in Elira's racing thoughts, though it did little to ease the sharp sting of betrayal his earlier omission had caused. She had believed from his first telling that he had been a helpless victim of his family's cruelty alone. Learning now that his own choices, his own weakness, had played a part in that old tragedy left her feeling as though the ground beneath their fragile new understanding had shifted unexpectedly. "You told me a different story," she said quietly. "In the gardens." "I told you the story as I have told myself for 30 years, Alden admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "It is easier, Miss Hale, to remember oneself as a victim of circumstance than to confront one's own failures honestly. I am not proud of that dishonesty, even the kind a man tells only himself, but I promise you this. Whatever weakness I showed as a young man has haunted me every single day since, and it is precisely that regret which has made me determined never to repeat such cowardice again." Elira said nothing, her mind a tangle of conflicting emotions. Across the table, Clara watched with poorly concealed satisfaction, believing she had successfully driven a wedge between her sister and their wealthy guest. She could not yet know how deeply her interference would come to be regretted, nor how the fragile trust she had shattered that evening would eventually be rebuilt into something far stronger than before, forged through honesty rather than convenient half-truths. Dinner ended shortly afterward, the remaining courses passing in strained, uncomfortable silence. Alden departed earlier than planned, his farewell to Elira brief and heavy with unspoken apology. Elira retreated to her room soon after, her mind racing with questions she did not yet know how to answer, while beneath her, in the quiet halls of the Hale estate, the consequences of Clara's careful scheming had only just begun to unfold. Sleep did not come easily to Elira that night. She lay awake long after the house had settled into silence, staring at the shadows shifting across her ceiling, turning over every word Alden had spoken at the dinner table, every flicker of shame that had crossed his weathered face. She did not know what troubled her more, the revelation itself, or the fact that he had allowed her to believe a gentler version of events for weeks before the truth emerged through her sister's calculated cruelty rather than his own honesty. By morning, exhaustion had settled into a quiet, determined resolve. Elira rose early, dressed simply, and made her way not toward Agnes Bell's cottage as she usually did, but toward her father's study, where she found Edmund already awake, nursing a cup of tea and staring blankly at a stack of unopened correspondence. "Father," she said, closing the door behind her, "I need to understand something clearly, and I need you to be honest with me." Edmund set down his tea, sensing the seriousness in his daughter's tone. Of course. Did you know, Elira asked, about the details Clara revealed last night, about Lord Voss's role in ending things with a leaner win? Edmund hesitated, and that hesitation alone told Elira most of what she needed to know. Your Uncle Gareth and I discussed the old rumors surrounding the scandal, yes, before Lord Voss's second visit. We did not know the full details Clara apparently uncovered, but we suspected the story was more complicated than simple family cruelty. We chose not to burden you with speculation, since it seemed unfair to color your judgment of the man before you had the chance to know him properly. Elira absorbed this, some of her anger softening into weary understanding. I wish you had told me anyway. I would rather have uncertain truth than comfortable ignorance, father. You are right, Edmund admitted. I am sorry. I have made many mistakes in handling this entire situation, starting with the desperate bargain I struck in the first place. I never intended to place you or your sisters in a position of such difficulty. Elira studied her father for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the exhaustion and guilt he had carried silently for weeks, beneath his own quiet desperation to save the family from ruin. Her anger, which had burned so hot the night before, cooled into something closer to weary compassion. I do not blame you for the bargain, she said finally. Desperate circumstances demand desperate choices. I only wish honesty had been given more priority from the start by all involved. She left her father's study without further conversation, her mind still unsettled but her resolve strengthened. Whatever she decided regarding Alden Voss, she would decide it based on her own honest assessment of the man, not on rumors filtered through her sister's jealousy or her father's careful omissions. Clara, meanwhile, found herself facing consequences she had not fully anticipated. Rather than driving Elira away from Alden as she had hoped, her interference at dinner had instead earned her the quiet, simmering disapproval of both her father and Miriam, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with her sister's scheming even as she shared some of the same disappointment over Alden's clear preference. You should not have done that, Miriam said quietly, finding Clara in the garden later that morning, staring blankly at the same overgrown roses where Alden and Elira had spoken weeks before. Whatever advantage you hope to gain, all you have truly accomplished is making yourself appear cruel and desperate. I only told the truth, Clara said defensively, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Elira deserved to know the full story before committing herself to a man who lied to her, even by omission. Perhaps, Miriam allowed, but you did not share that truth out of concern for her well-being, Clara. You shared it because you were angry that he chose her over you, and you wanted to hurt them both for it. Do not pretend otherwise, not to me. Clara had no ready answer for this, and the two sisters stood in uncomfortable silence for a long moment before Miriam finally turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Clara alone with the weight of her own actions settling uncomfortably upon her. 3 days passed before Alden returned to the estate, and when he did, his manner was subdued, careful, entirely lacking the confident ease that had characterized his more recent visits. He found Elira in the small library at the back of the house, a room rarely used by anyone else in the family, where she had taken to spending her quiet hours since the difficult dinner. Miss Hale, he said from the doorway, his voice hesitant in a way she had not heard from him before. I would understand entirely if you did not wish to see me, but I hoped you might allow me a few moments regardless. Elira set down the book she had been reading, though not truly absorbing, and gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit, my lord. I believe we have things to discuss. Alden lowered himself into the offered chair, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap, his eyes carrying an uncertainty that seemed strange on a man of his standing and years. I owe you a proper apology, he began, not merely for the events of that dinner, but for the incomplete story I offered you in the garden that first week. I told myself at the time that I was sparing you unnecessary detail, that the essential truth of my grief remained accurate regardless of the finer points of blame. But I understand now that such reasoning was simply a comfortable excuse to avoid confronting my own weakness aloud. Why did you avoid it? Elira asked, her tone neither accusing nor forgiving, simply curious. Alden was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Shame, I suppose, more than anything else. It is one thing to grieve a love stolen by cruel circumstances beyond your control. It is another entirely to admit that you yourself failed to fight hard enough for that love when it mattered most, that your own cowardice played as great a role in its loss as any external force. The first story allows a man to remain, in his own mind, a tragic figure. The second forces him to confront himself as something far less flattering. Elira considered this honestly, finding within his words an uncomfortable truth she recognized in herself as well, though on a far smaller scale. She thought of the many small moments in her own life when she had chosen the comfortable half-truth over difficult honesty, when she had allowed convenient silence to stand in for harder conversations. I understand the temptation, she admitted quietly. That does not mean I am not still troubled by it. You allowed me to build trust in you based on an incomplete picture, my lord. That matters, regardless of how understandable your reasons might be. You are right, Alden said, and I will not ask you to simply set that concern aside because I have explained my reasoning. I ask only for the chance to prove, through my future actions rather than my past excuses, that I am capable of the honesty our situation deserves going forward. Elira studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the raw vulnerability in his expression, so different from the confident, calculating nobleman who had first arrived at her family's estate weeks before. Whatever else remained uncertain between them, she believed, at least, in the sincerity of this particular apology. Very well, she said finally. I accept your apology, my lord, but I will ask you this. If there are other difficult truths still unspoken between us, other details you have softened or avoided for the sake of comfort, I would rather hear them now, from you directly, than discover them later through my sister's scheming or anyone else's whispered rumors. Alden nodded slowly, seeming to understand the weight of what she was asking. There is one more matter, he admitted, though I do not believe it carries the same shame as the first. My decision to seek a bride through your father's desperate offer was not entirely as simple as I first presented it, either. I have, in truth, considered marriage several times over the years, always for practical reasons rather than any hope of genuine affection, given how thoroughly I believed my capacity for such feeling had died along with Elena. Your father's letters arrived at a moment when I had grown particularly weary of my own solitude, and I confess I approached the entire arrangement with far more cynicism than I have shown since meeting you. And now, Elira asked, do you still approach this with cynicism? No, Alden said, his voice suddenly quiet and sincere in a way that made Elira's chest tighten unexpectedly. Now I find myself hoping, for the first time in 30 years, for something I had long ago convinced myself I no longer deserved or desired. I do not ask you to return such feeling immediately, or even at all, Miss Hale. I ask only for the continued chance to prove myself worthy of your trust, honestly and openly, without further hidden shame standing between us. The library fell quiet, the afternoon light shifting gently through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes drifting slowly in the still air. Elira found herself studying the old nobleman before her with new eyes, seeing past the wealth and title to the flawed, honest, deeply human man beneath, a man who had spent 30 years punishing himself for a youthful failure of courage, and who now stood tentatively at the threshold of something he had long believed permanently closed to him. I appreciate your honesty, she said finally, more than you might realize. Trust once shaken cannot be rebuilt in a single conversation, my lord. But I am willing to continue forward carefully, and with the understanding that honesty, difficult as it may sometimes be, must remain the foundation of whatever we build between us. Alden's relief was visible, softening the tense lines of his weathered face. That is more than I dared hope for this afternoon, Miss Hale, thank you. Outside the library, unseen by either of them, Clara stood frozen in the hallway, having come seeking her father but instead overhearing enough of the conversation to understand that her scheme had failed entirely to achieve its intended effect. Rather than driving a permanent wedge between Alira and Alden, her interference had instead forced a deeper, more honest reckoning between them, one that seemed, if anything, to have strengthened the fragile bond growing steadily between her younger sister and the wealthy nobleman she had so desperately wanted for herself. Clara turned away from the library door, her earlier anger curdling slowly into something closer to bitter resignation, though a small, stubborn part of her mind had already begun turning toward other, more desperate measures, unwilling yet to accept defeat entirely. Whatever new scheme might be forming in the shadows of her wounded pride, it would soon threaten far more than simple hurt feelings, placing the entire fragile arrangement, and perhaps even the family's restored fortune, in genuine jeopardy. Autumn deepened into its final weeks, the orchard trees stripped bare, the fields turned brown and waiting for winter's first frost. Through it all, the bond between Alira and Alden continued to grow, slowly and carefully, built now on a foundation of honesty rather than convenient omission. He visited nearly every day, no longer bothering with formal pretense, arriving instead in simple riding clothes to walk with her among the tenant cottages, learning the names of the families who worked her father's land, listening with genuine interest as she described their struggles and small victories. Agnes Bell, fully recovered now from her fever, took a particular delight in Alden's visits, teasing him gently about his age and his fine clothes while accepting the small kindnesses he began quietly extending toward the estate's poorer tenants: extra coal for the winter, medicine for children with persistent coughs, small repairs to leaking roofs that Edmund's strained finances had long neglected. "You are trying to win my approval, my lord," Agnes said one afternoon, watching him help repair a loose fence post outside her cottage, his fine coat discarded and his sleeves rolled up despite the cold. "I hope you know that." "Is it working?" Alden asked, a faint smile touching his weathered face, so different now from the guarded stranger who had first arrived at the estate. "Perhaps," Agnes allowed, "though it is Alira's approval you should be more concerned with winning, not mine." Alira, standing nearby with a basket of bread for another tenant family, felt her cheeks warm at this observation, though she said nothing, choosing instead to busy herself with the practical tasks of the afternoon. But she had noticed, in recent weeks, a gradual softening in her own guarded heart, a warmth growing steadily alongside her continued wariness, difficult to deny even to herself. It was during one such quiet afternoon, walking back toward the main house as the winter sun began its early descent, that Alden finally gave voice to something he had clearly been considering for some time. "Miss Hale," he said, slowing his pace, "I find myself in an unusual position. When I first arrived at your family's estate, I sought only companionship, a practical arrangement to ease the loneliness of my remaining years. I did not expect, nor did I believe myself capable of expecting, anything resembling genuine affection." Alira slowed as well, sensing the weight building behind his words. "And now?" "Now," Alden said, turning to face her fully, his expression earnest and slightly nervous in a way that seemed almost boyish despite his years, "I find that what I feel for you has grown into something far beyond mere practical companionship. I do not say this to pressure you toward any decision before you are ready, Miss Hale. I say it only because I promised you honesty, and it would be dishonest to continue pretending my feelings remain as simple and practical as they were when I first arrived at your father's door." Alira's heart beat faster, though she was uncertain whether from surprise, pleasure, or lingering nervousness. "I do not know that I am ready to speak of such things yet, my lord." "I understand," Alden said quickly, "and I do not ask you to be. I only wished for you to know the truth of my heart, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge." They continued walking in comfortable silence after that, the unspoken warmth between them settling into something neither entirely acknowledged nor entirely denied, a quiet understanding growing steadily despite the many uncertainties still surrounding their unusual arrangement. Back at the house, however, Clara's bitter resignation had, in the weeks since her failed attempt at dinner, hardened into something colder and more determined. She had spent long hours turning over every scrap of information she had gathered, searching for some new angle, some fresh weapon to wield against the growing closeness between her sister and the wealthy nobleman she still believed should rightfully have chosen her instead. Her opportunity arrived unexpectedly, through a chance encounter with one of Alden's own household staff, a young footman named Corwin who had accompanied his master on several recent visits, and had, over the following weeks, developed something of a fondness for Clara's attention, flattered by the interest of a baron's daughter despite his lower standing. "You seem troubled, Miss Hale," Corwin observed one afternoon, finding Clara alone in the estate's small orchard, staring blankly at the bare branches overhead. "Might I ask what weighs on your mind?" Clara, recognizing an opportunity when it presented itself, allowed a carefully calculated measure of vulnerability into her expression. "It is nothing you would understand, I am sure. Simply family matters, complicated and difficult to explain." "Try me," Corwin offered, clearly eager to prove himself useful to a young woman he found increasingly captivating. "I have served Lord Voss for nearly 10 years now. I have seen a great deal of complicated family matters in that time." Over the following weeks, through careful, patient cultivation of Corwin's growing infatuation, Clara learned details of Alden's estate and finances that she believed might prove useful, including the existence of a distant relative, a nephew named Rowan Voss, who stood to inherit the bulk of Alden's fortune should the old nobleman die without producing an heir of his own, and who had, according to Corwin's careful gossip, expressed considerable displeasure upon learning of his uncle's unexpected marriage plans. Clara turned this information over carefully, recognizing in it the seeds of a far more effective scheme than her previous clumsy attempt at dinner. Rather than attacking Alden's character directly, which had only strengthened his bond with Elira, she began instead to consider how she might use his nephew's clear resentment to create obstacles far more difficult to overcome than mere hurt feelings and awkward dinner conversation. She wrote a careful letter to Rowan Voss, presenting herself as a concerned friend of the family, offering vague but troubling hints about Elira's suitability as a bride, suggesting without directly stating that the youngest Hale daughter's interest in his uncle stemmed primarily from mercenary calculation regarding the family's crushing debts, rather than any genuine affection. She was careful to phrase everything in a manner that could not easily be traced back to jealousy or malice, presenting herself instead as a disinterested party, motivated only by concern for Lord Voss's well-being. The letter once sent could not be recalled, and Clara found herself waiting anxiously over the following days for some sign of its effect, uncertain whether her careful scheme would succeed where her more direct approach had failed, or whether it would simply create fresh complications she had not fully anticipated. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm quietly gathering against them, Elira and Alden continued their careful courtship, the warmth between them deepening steadily with each passing week. Edmund, watching from a cautious distance, found himself increasingly relieved by the genuine affection growing between his youngest daughter and the nobleman, whose fortune had once seemed his family's only hope of survival. What had begun as a desperate, transactional bargain had transformed, against all his expectations, into something that looked remarkably like genuine happiness for his often overlooked youngest child. Miriam, too, found her earlier disappointment softening into something closer to genuine gladness for her sister, though a small, wistful part of her still wondered what might have been had circumstances unfolded differently. She had begun, in recent weeks, corresponding with a modest but kind young gentleman from a neighboring estate, a connection that offered none of the dramatic wealth or title of Lord Voss, but which carried within it the quiet promise of genuine compatibility, something Miriam found herself increasingly grateful for as she watched the complicated tangle of emotions still surrounding her elder sister's unresolved bitterness. It was nearly a fortnight after Clara's letter had been sent that its consequences finally began to surface, arriving not through any direct confrontation, but through a sudden, unexpected chill in Alden's own manner, a guardedness that had not been present in weeks, appearing without warning during what should have been an ordinary afternoon visit. Alira noticed it immediately, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained during their walk through the garden, so different from the easy warmth of recent weeks. "Is something troubling you, my lord?" she asked finally, unable to bear the strange, unexplained distance any longer. Alden hesitated, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict before finally speaking. "I received a letter recently," he said carefully, "from my nephew Rowan. It contains certain concerns regarding the nature of your interest in our arrangement." Alira's stomach tightened with immediate, sharp unease. "What sort of concerns?" "Suggestions," Alden said, choosing his words with obvious difficulty, "that your affection toward me might be motivated more by your family's financial circumstances than by genuine feeling. I do not wish to believe such suggestions, Miss Hale, truly I do not. But I promised myself, after the pain of losing Alina, that I would never again allow blind hope to override honest caution. I find myself, despite every instinct urging me to dismiss these concerns entirely, unable to fully silence the small, nagging doubt they have planted." Alira felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her once again, betrayal and hurt tangling painfully in her chest. She did not yet know the letter's true origin, but she understood immediately the damage such doubt could inflict upon the fragile trust they had worked so carefully to rebuild since Clara's earlier interference. "I cannot control what your nephew believes or what doubts he plants in your mind," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I can only tell you honestly, as I have from the very beginning, that whatever grew between us grew entirely apart from any calculation regarding my family's debts. If that honesty is not enough to overcome a stranger's unfounded suspicion, then I do not know what more I can offer." Alden's expression softened with visible regret at the hurt evident in her voice. "Forgive me, Miss Hale. I did not mean to suggest I believed his accusations entirely. I only meant to be honest with you, as I promised, rather than allowing such doubts to fester silently between us unspoken." But even as he offered reassurance, a seed of uncertainty had been planted, one that neither of them yet realized had been deliberately sown by someone far closer to home than either suspected, threatening now to grow into something that would soon force a far more dramatic reckoning than either had anticipated when they first began this careful, hopeful courtship weeks before. The days following Alden's confession about his nephew's letter passed heavily over the Hale estate, a quiet tension settling into every corner of the house. Alira found herself replaying their conversation endlessly, wounded not by the accusation itself, which she knew to be false, but by the visible doubt it had stirred in Alden despite his best efforts to reassure her otherwise. Trust, once shaken, she was learning, did not simply return to its former solidity through a single honest conversation. It was Miriam, of all people, who first noticed the small inconsistencies that would eventually unravel the truth behind the mysterious letter. She had observed, over recent weeks, Clara's unusual friendliness toward Corwin, the young footman in Lord Voss's service, a friendliness that seemed entirely out of character for a young woman who had previously shown little interest in servants regardless of their master's standing. She had also noticed Clara's frequent, secretive letter writing, conducted always behind a carefully locked door, and her sister's poorly concealed satisfaction in the days following Alden's sudden coldness toward Alira. Miriam said nothing at first, uncertain of her suspicions and reluctant to accuse her own sister without clear evidence. But her unease grew steadily until, nearly a week after Alden's initial confession, she finally found the courage to confront Clara directly, cornering her in the small sitting room where their mother's old writing desk still stood, untouched for years except by Clara's recent, frequent use. "I know what you have done," Miriam said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I do not know the exact details, but I know enough. The friendliness with Corwin, the secretive letters, your satisfaction when Lord Voss grew distant from Alira. It is not difficult to piece together, Clara, once one begins looking properly." Clara's face paled, though she attempted briefly to maintain her composure. "I do not know what you are suggesting." "Do not insult me by pretending otherwise," Miriam said, her usual gentleness hardening into something firmer than Clara had ever heard from her before. "I have watched you grow more bitter and more desperate with each passing week, Clara, and I understand your disappointment, truly I do. I hoped for that match myself once, but what you are doing now goes beyond simple disappointment. You are actively working to destroy something genuinely good, something that has brought our sister more happiness than I have seen in her in years, simply because you cannot bear to see her succeed where you have failed." Clara's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely, tears of frustration and shame welling in her eyes. "You do not understand what it is like," she said, her voice breaking. "To watch everything I hoped for, everything I prepared myself for, simply handed to a sister who did not even want it, who arrived late and unprepared and somehow still managed to capture his attention without even trying. Do you know how that feels, Miriam? To work so hard for something, only to watch it slip away so easily, given freely to someone who never even asked for it." "I understand disappointment," Miriam said, her tone softening slightly despite her continued firmness. "But Clara, listen to yourself. You are not fighting for happiness anymore. You are fighting simply to ensure that if you cannot have what you wanted, no one else should have it either. That is not love or even ambition anymore. That is simply bitterness, and it will destroy you long before it destroys anyone else if you continue down this path." Clara said nothing for a long moment, the weight of her sister's words settling heavily upon her, mixing uncomfortably with the guilt she had been quietly suppressing since sending that fateful letter to Rowan Voss. Finally, she buried her face in her hands, her earlier scheming resolve crumbling entirely beneath the accumulated weight of shame and exhaustion. "I wrote to his nephew," she admitted, her voice muffled and thick with tears. "I suggested that Alira's interest was motivated by our family's debts rather than genuine feeling. I did not think it would cause such damage. I only wanted to slow things down, to create enough doubt that perhaps Lord Voss might reconsider, might look toward me instead, once the shine of his infatuation with Alira had worn away." Miriam absorbed this confession with a heavy sigh, disappointment, and something close to pity mingling in her expression. "You must tell them," she said finally, "both Alira and Lord Voss. Whatever consequences follow from your honesty, they will be far less severe than the consequences of continuing to let this deception fester unaddressed." "I cannot," Clara said, panic flooding her voice at the thought. "Alira will hate me, father will be ashamed of me, I will have ruined everything for nothing." "You have already ruined things, Clara," Miriam said gently but firmly. "The only question now is whether you will compound that ruin with continued dishonesty, or whether you will begin, however painfully, the process of making it right." It took 2 more days of internal struggle before Clara finally found the courage to act on her sister's counsel. She chose to confess first to their father, finding him alone in his study on a gray, overcast afternoon, the weight of her confession pouring out in a rush of tears and stammered explanation. Edmund listened in heavy, disappointed silence, his expression carrying none of the anger Clara had feared, but instead a deep, weary sadness that felt somehow far worse. "I raised you better than this," he said finally, his voice quiet with disappointment. "Whatever disappointment you carried, Clara, this was not the answer. You must make this right immediately with both your sister and Lord Voss. I will not intervene on your behalf to soften the consequences of what you have done." Clara found Alira in the library that evening, the same quiet room where Alira had first confronted Alden about the truth of his history with a leaner Wynne. Alira looked up from her book as her sister entered, immediately sensing from Clara's reddened eyes and trembling hands that something significant had occurred. "I need to tell you something," Clara said, her voice barely steady, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond, however angry you become." Alira set down her book slowly, bracing herself for whatever confession was about to unfold. Clara recounted everything, the letter to Rowan Voss, the deliberate suggestion of mercenary motives, the careful cultivation of Corwin's affection to gather information she had then weaponized against her own sister's happiness. By the time she finished, tears streamed freely down her face, and Alira sat in stunned, heavy silence, processing the full weight of her sister's betrayal. "Why?" Elira asked finally, her voice tight with a complicated mixture of hurt and anger. "I never wanted this arrangement in the first place, Clara. I never sought to take anything from you. Why could you not simply let me be, rather than working so deliberately to poison something that finally brought me genuine happiness?" "Because I was jealous," Clara admitted, the raw honesty of the confession clearly costing her considerable effort. "Because I had convinced myself that this match was owed to me, that I deserved it more than you, simply because I had wanted it and prepared for it while you had not. I told myself that justified whatever measures I took to reclaim it. I understand now how wrong I was, and I understand that no explanation I offer can fully undo the harm I have caused. I only hope, in time, that you might find it possible to forgive me, even if you cannot forget what I have done." Elira sat in silence for a long moment, her anger warring with the genuine remorse evident in her sister's tearful confession. She thought of Alden's own confession weeks before, his admission of youthful cowardice regarding Alina Wynne, and the difficult but ultimately strengthening honesty that had followed. Perhaps, she thought slowly, forgiveness built through difficult confession might prove as valuable here as it had proven there. "I am deeply hurt by what you have done," Elira said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I do not know how quickly I will be able to trust you again, Clara, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to ease your guilt. But I appreciate that you have found the courage to confess this yourself, rather than allowing me to discover it through other means. That courage, at least, counts for something." The following morning, with Clara's reluctant but genuine agreement, Elira rode to Alden's estate herself, accompanied only by a single servant for propriety's sake, determined to address the damage directly rather than allowing further doubt to fester unaddressed. She found Alden in his study, his expression brightening with surprised pleasure at her unexpected arrival, quickly followed by concern at the evident seriousness in her manner. "Miss Hale," he said, rising immediately from his desk. "Is something wrong?" "I have learned the true source of your nephew's concerns," Elira said, without preamble, settling into the chair he offered her. "It was not, as we both assumed, some independent observation on Rowan's part. It was my own sister, Clara, motivated by jealousy over your choice of myself rather than her, who deliberately planted those suggestions in his mind." Alden's expression shifted rapidly through surprise, understanding, and finally a kind of relieved vindication that visibly eased the tension he had carried since receiving his nephew's troubling letter. "I confess," he said slowly, "a part of me suspected something of this nature, though I did not wish to accuse your family without clear evidence. I am deeply sorry, Miss Hale, for allowing such doubt to affect my manner toward you, even briefly." "You need not apologize," Elira said. "You acted with reasonable caution given the information available to you. I only wished for you to know the truth, directly and completely, so that no further doubt might linger unaddressed between us." Alden reached across the small distance separating them, taking her hand gently in his own weathered fingers. "Thank you for trusting me with this truth, difficult as it must have been to share. I find myself, more with each passing day, increasingly certain of what I feel toward you, Miss Hale, doubt and complication notwithstanding." Elira felt her own uncertainty softening further at this quiet declaration, the accumulated weight of recent weeks' difficulties beginning, slowly, to give way to something steadier and more hopeful. Whatever challenges still remained, whatever careful rebuilding of trust still lay ahead with her sister, and within their own fragile courtship, she found herself believing, for the first time with genuine confidence, that the foundation they were building together might prove strong enough to weather whatever difficulties still lay ahead. Winter arrived in earnest over the following weeks, blanketing the Hale estate in soft, quiet snow that transformed the once crumbling grounds into something almost magical. The bare orchard branches now dusted white, the frozen pond behind the house catching the pale winter light like scattered silver. Within the house itself, a similar transformation had taken place, slower and less visible than the snow outside, but no less profound. Clara's confession had marked the beginning of a difficult but genuine reconciliation between the sisters. She had spent the following weeks in quiet, humbled effort to rebuild what her jealousy had damaged, taking on additional household duties without complaint, offering small, thoughtful kindnesses toward Elira that spoke more clearly than any words could of her genuine remorse. Elira, for her part, found her earlier hurt slowly softening into cautious but genuine forgiveness, understanding that her sister's jealousy, however poorly expressed, had sprung from real pain rather than simple cruelty. Rowan Voss, once the true source of the letter's origin was revealed to him through his uncle's careful explanation, wrote a stiff but sincere apology to Elira, acknowledging that he had allowed an unverified rumor to color his judgment unfairly. Though the relationship between Elira and Alden's nephew remained somewhat formal in the months that followed, the immediate crisis had been fully resolved, leaving behind only the valuable lesson of how easily doubt could take root when honesty faltered, even briefly. Alden's visits continued through the winter months, now carrying an easy warmth that had survived, and in some ways been strengthened by, the various trials of recent weeks. He arrived one particularly cold afternoon, shortly before the new year, with a request that immediately caught Elira's attention. "I would like," he said, as they sat together near the fire in the drawing room, "to speak with your father if you are amenable regarding a matter of considerable importance." Elira's heart quickened, understanding immediately the significance of his careful words. "What matter would that be, my lord?" "I believe you already suspect," Alden said, a rare, genuine smile touching his weathered face. "I have spent these recent months coming to know you properly, Miss Hale, apart from any shadow of the past or any desperate practical arrangement. I find myself more certain with each passing day that what has grown between us is genuine and worthy of a proper, honest commitment. But I do not wish to proceed without first ensuring, clearly and directly, that this is truly what you want as well, not merely what circumstances or family obligation might suggest." Elira considered his words carefully, thinking back over the strange, difficult journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first startled meeting in the courtyard through the painful revelations, the sisterly betrayal, and the slow, careful rebuilding of trust that had followed. Whatever uncertainty had once colored her feelings toward this unexpected arrangement had, she realized now, transformed entirely into something she recognized, with quiet but genuine certainty, as love. "It is what I want," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Not out of obligation to my family, and not simply because circumstances brought us together in such an unusual way. I have come to care for you deeply, my lord, for the honest, thoughtful man you have shown yourself to be beneath the wealth and title." Alden's relief and joy were evident in his expression, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in comfortable, hopeful silence as the fire crackled softly beside them, and snow continued to fall gently outside the frosted windows. The formal proposal, when it came a few days later, was conducted with proper ceremony before Edmund, who granted his blessing with evident, tearful relief, the accumulated weight of months of uncertainty and financial desperation finally lifting fully from his shoulders. Clara and Miriam both offered their genuine congratulations, Clara's slightly more subdued, but no less sincere than her sister's, the last remaining traces of old jealousy finally giving way entirely to genuine happiness for her sister's evident joy. Agnes Bell, when informed of the news during Elira's next visit, laughed with delighted satisfaction. "I knew it from the very first day you told me his story," she said, patting Elira's hand fondly. "An old man carrying such grief for 30 years does not simply move on so quickly unless something truly remarkable has caught his heart. I am glad it was you, child. You deserve such happiness, after all the quiet kindness you have shown to others." The wedding was arranged for early spring, time to coincide with the first blooming of the orchard trees that Alden had described so fondly during their earlier walks together. It was a modest affair by the standards of Alden's wealth and title, held in the small chapel nearest the Hale estate rather than any grand cathedral, attended primarily by family, and the tenant families Elira had cared for so faithfully over the years, rather than the polished nobility Alden might once have invited to such an occasion. Elira wore a simple gown, elegant but unadorned, her hair arranged loosely rather than in the elaborate style Clara had once favored for herself in anticipation of this very match. As she walked down the short aisle toward Alden, who waited with an expression of pure, unguarded joy that erased decades of accumulated grief from his weathered features, she caught sight of the small portrait of her mother that she had brought along and placed carefully near the altar, a quiet acknowledgment of the family history that had, in such unexpected ways, led her to this moment. Gareth, Marguerite's brother, stood among the small gathering, having grown close to the family throughout the recent months, as the strange connection between Eleanor Wynne's old tragedy and Elira's unexpected happiness had slowly come to light. He watched the ceremony with quiet satisfaction, feeling, in some small way, that his long-departed aunt's old sorrow had finally found a measure of peace through her great-niece's genuine happiness, decades after her own story had ended so painfully. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, the vows exchanged simply and sincerely, without elaborate flourish, each word carrying the weight of the honest, hard-won trust that had been built between them through months of difficulty and careful rebuilding. When Alden finally kissed his new bride, the small gathered crowd erupted into genuine, warm applause. The quiet chapel filled suddenly with laughter and relieved joy after so many months of uncertainty and difficulty. Following the ceremony, a modest celebration was held in the Hale estate's largest hall, now restored to something resembling its former grandeur through the debt relief Alden's original bargain had provided, though the family had chosen to preserve much of its worn, comfortable character rather than pursuing excessive renovation. Tenants mingled freely with the small gathering of nobility Alden had invited, a mixture that would have seemed scandalous to more traditional households, but which suited perfectly the genuine, unpretentious happiness of the occasion. Clara approached Elira during a quiet moment in the celebration, her expression carrying both genuine warmth and lingering traces of old regret. "I am truly happy for you," she said, embracing her sister with unexpected sincerity. "I know I do not entirely deserve to say so, given everything that happened, but I mean it, Elira, with my whole heart." "I know you do," Elira said gently, returning the embrace. "We have both grown a great deal these past months, Clara. I am grateful that we have found our way back to genuine sisterhood, difficult as that path proved to be." As the celebration continued into the evening, Alden found a quiet moment to draw Elira aside, leading her out onto the small balcony overlooking the estate's orchard, now beginning to show the first tentative signs of spring growth despite the lingering winter chill in the evening air. "I never believed," he said quietly, taking her hands in his own, "that I would find such happiness again, after everything I lost so many years ago. I spent 30 years believing myself undeserving of it, punishing myself quietly for a youthful failure of courage that cost me the woman I loved." "And now?" Elira asked softly. "Now," Alden said, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns strung along the balcony, "I understand that grief, however genuine, does not have to define the entirety of a man's remaining years. You have taught me that, Elira, more than anything else. You showed me that honesty, however difficult, builds something far stronger than comfortable illusion ever could, and that love, when it is genuine, can find its way even through the most unexpected and complicated of circumstances." Elira leaned into him, feeling the warmth of genuine contentment settle over her, so different from the confusion and uncertainty that had marked their earliest encounters months before. Whatever challenges still lay ahead in their new life together, she felt certain now, with quiet, unshakable confidence, that they would face them together, honestly and openly, exactly as they had learned to do throughout their difficult but ultimately rewarding courtship. Below them, the celebration continued, laughter and music drifting up into the cool evening air, while above, the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, watching over a family finally restored, not merely in fortune, but in genuine, hard-won happiness that neither wealth nor title could have provided on their own. A full year passed before the northern estate that had once felt so distant and unfamiliar to Alira became, in every meaningful sense, her home. She had brought with her not only her modest belongings, but a way of living that gradually reshaped the quiet, guarded household Alden had maintained alone for so many decades. Tenants who had once approached the manor with cautious formality now found themselves greeted warmly at the kitchen door, where Alira had established a standing practice of setting aside bread and simple remedies for any family in need, much as she had once done for Agnes Bell. Alden watched these changes unfold with quiet wonder, often remarking that the house seemed to breathe differently since her arrival, as though rooms long closed off had finally been given permission to hold light and laughter again. He spent less time now in solitary reflection within his library, and more time walking the grounds beside his wife, learning from her the same patient attentiveness toward the estate's workers that she had shown so naturally back at her father's crumbling manor. Their correspondence with the Hale family remained steady and warm. Edmund visited twice that first year, each time marveling at how thoroughly his once overlooked youngest daughter had transformed not only her own circumstances, but the temperament of a household that had, by all accounts, been cold and closed for decades before her arrival. Miriam had, by the second visit, become engaged to the kind young gentleman from the neighboring estate, and she wrote to Alira often, filled with the same quiet gladness that had once seemed impossible amid the tensions of that difficult autumn. Clara's transformation proved the most striking of all. She had thrown herself, in the months following the wedding, into managing what remained of her father's estate with a diligence and care that surprised everyone who remembered her earlier vanity and ambition. She wrote to Alira regularly, her letters filled increasingly with genuine warmth rather than the careful, guarded politeness of their earliest reconciliation. In one such letter, arriving nearly a year after the wedding, Clara confessed that she had begun teaching reading to several of the tenant children on their father's land, a small kindness that Alira recognized, with quiet pride, as an echo of the compassion she herself had always tried to model. Rowan Voss, too, gradually softened toward his new aunt, his initial wariness giving way over repeated visits to genuine respect, particularly once he witnessed firsthand the careful, honest partnership his uncle had built with his young wife. He confessed once, during a quiet evening's conversation, that he had never seen his uncle so at peace, and that whatever doubts he had once carried had long since been replaced by genuine gladness for the happiness he now observed. It was during the second spring of their marriage that Alden brought Alira to a small, overgrown corner of the estate's oldest cemetery, where a modest, weathered headstone bore the name Eleanor Wynne, moved there years earlier through Alden's quiet, private arrangement, long before Alira had ever entered his life. He had never spoken of visiting this place regularly, though the well-tended grass around the stone suggested he had, in fact, continued to honor her memory faithfully over the years. "I wanted you to see this," he said quietly, "not out of any lingering confusion between the two of you, but because I believe she would have wanted to know that the love I once lost eventually found its way, however strangely, to happiness again. I no longer visit this place out of grief alone, Alira. I visit now with gratitude, understanding that her memory and the pain of losing her ultimately led me, through circumstances neither of us could have foreseen, to you." Alira knelt beside the old headstone, placing a small bundle of early spring flowers gently against its weathered surface. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said softly. "I believe she would be glad, knowing the story did not end simply in sorrow." They stood together in quiet reflection for a long while before turning back toward the house, the orchard blossoms beginning their familiar seasonal bloom around them, filling the air with a soft, sweet fragrance that seemed, in that particular moment, to carry within it the quiet promise of continued renewal. Their first child, a daughter, was born the following winter, and Alden insisted, without hesitation, that she be given the name Eleanor, not out of any confusion regarding the past, but as a deliberate, loving acknowledgement of the long, complicated road that had ultimately led to her existence. Alira agreed readily, understanding fully the significance behind the choice, and finding in it a fitting close to the story that had begun so unexpectedly on that cold morning in her father's courtyard. Years later, when little Elena grew old enough to ask about her unusual name, Elira would tell her the whole story, beginning to end, exactly as it had happened. She would tell her about the desperate bargain that had brought a wealthy, grieving nobleman to a struggling baron's door, about the late arrival that had changed everything, about the painful betrayals and difficult honesty that had tested and ultimately strengthened a fragile new love, and about the quiet, hard-won happiness that had followed, built not on wealth or convenient circumstance, but on the difficult, deliberate choice to remain honest with one another, even when honesty proved painful. And every time she told the story, Elira would end it the same way, reminding her daughter that even the most unexpected beginnings, however strange or complicated, could grow into something lasting and true, provided both people involved were willing to choose honesty over comfort, and genuine partnership over convenient illusion, again and again, for as long as they both should live.